Hi, welcome back, and welcome to my backyard. The slide in the center, the picture in the center of the slide shows the west side of my house looking toward the fringe of forest that we have behind the house. And that's where my spring wildflower garden is. I'd like to talk a little bit about spring ephemerals and what they are before we begin. Ephemeral may not be a word you use every day in the cafeteria, but it means here today and gone tomorrow. Flowers that are, or plants that are ephemerals don't have a very long blooming season or visible life cycle. There are different kinds of ephemerals in a number of different ecosystems where plants need to be in a hurry. There are desert ephemerals where there's only water at certain times of the year. There are tide flat ephemerals. But the kind that we are concerned with here today are the spring wildflower ephemerals that grow in eastern deciduous forests. And their reason for hurry is that sunlight is limited for them. They need to get their growing and blooming and seed setting done before the trees leaf out. And that means they are not around longer than from, basically the season goes from mid-March to mid-May. And within that, many of the flowers bloom for only a week or so. If you really want to understand spring ephemerals, I suggest you read the article that I put in the resources list that is called something like The Badass Spring Ephemerals, and it talks about how tough they are. Let me just summarize here by saying spring ephemerals need rich, moist soils. They need the sunlight when they can get it. And they also, most of them, need mycorrhizal relationships. And I'm sure your professors will cover this in more detail in this course, but those are relationships that plants have with fungi underground, with their roots. And the mycorrhizal filaments can provide moisture and nutrients for the plant in symbiotic relationships. And these are important because when the temperatures are low, as they in the soil are low, as they are in the spring, it's harder to extract nutrients from the soil. You can't talk about spring ephemerals without also talking about the forests that they are part of and that they depend on. And eastern deciduous forests are most of the forests that cover the eastern half or so of the United States. And they set leaves in the spring and drop their leaves in the fall. On my property, I'm going to introduce you to two of the trees that we have. The most common kind of tree on our property are the hackberry trees. And in the lower left corner, you can see the bark of a hackberry tree. They're very easy to identify because of this distinctive ridged bark that they have. They are probably here because they're successional trees, they're colonizers. They come in fairly quickly after land has been cleared. And that probably means that the land we have was cleared, probably for an orchard years ago, and these trees have grown back since. In the foreground, you see a bare trunk, and that belongs to a tulip tree. This tree is here because my husband and I planted it. when we moved here 18 years ago. And it is a working tree. We put it there because we wanted to shade the west side of our house to keep the house cool and to keep cooling costs down. And it's done very well at that. We chose the tulip tree for several reasons. That species, for one thing, it's a native species. It's the state tree of Indiana. And as a native to Pennsylvania, where we didn't have this tree, I thought that was kind of cool to plant the state tree near our house. These are the giants of the East. They are the tallest tree east of the Mississippi. They go well over 100 feet and can be hundreds of years old. I also like this tree because it has an unusually shaped leaf, which you can't see here, but if you're not familiar with it, you could look it up easily. And the distinctive tulip-like flower. As I look back on this choice, two questions I have are, was it prudent to plant this big of a tree 15 feet from the house? Maybe 20 feet would have been better, but we're not going back now. The other question that I have is, should it have been an oak? Since the time we planted this tree, I've read Doug Tallamy. I'm kind of a fan of him, and he's listed in the resource list I gave you. Ptolemy is an entomologist who studies the relationships between plants and insects. And he has found that over 500 species depend on or use oak trees. Tulip trees have far fewer species than that, still more than non-native species, but I think it's more like 200 or something. I'm not sure why. That could be. My theory is that these are very ancient trees. That flower structure is a more primitive design than some other kinds of flowers. And maybe the original partners that this tree had are extinct now. I don't know. That's just a theory. All right, let's go on to the land and look at the forest floor. Take a look at the forest floor in my wildflower garden. As you can see, I don't manage this garden the way the typical garden center gardener does. I don't have a clump of peonies here, bark chips in the middle, clump of tulips there, and not much else. This is a real mixture of different plants all mingled together wherever they kind of choose to go. And what I do is I try to discourage plants I don't want, like invasive species or briars or tree seedlings. I don't really want trees in this area. And then I try to encourage the plants that I want. Sometimes I'll transplant them and move them around to bare spots. And sometimes I'll spread seeds if I want more of something. And anyway, the result is a more natural look of the way plants tend to grow in the wild. As we move along here, you can see we're zeroing in right now on cutleaf toothwort. That's a small, delicate plant that grows. There's a lot of it in Thomas Woods near Reef Village. You would see it if you were living there. Over here, we're looking at some toadshade trillium. You can see it has three leaf, 3 leaves, and parallel veins like a monocot we would expect. And that's from the lily family. Right now, I just touched the trout lily leaves. We'll see some of that blooming later. There's also violets in there. There's some fiddleheads right above the trout lily. I see some wild ginger in the middle top of the picture, the pointed leaf there. That gets I didn't put a slide in about that, but it's got a red flower down on the ground, and you might want to just think about why would a plant put its flower down low? And then the lacy foliage over here on the right is sweet cecily, which is an edible plant, tastes a little bit like licorice, and that blooms later in May. As we walk up the path, the first thing that you might notice are the Virginia bluebells there on the left. Most spring wildflowers are not very showy, but Virginia bluebells are the exception, and many people are particularly fond of them for that reason. They are this electric blue color that even the video doesn't do justice to them, I would say. Especially on a gray day, they just seem to blaze out there. They have a long flower. You need to have a long tongue if you want to pollinate this plant. There you can see that when they're just budding, they're more of a brilliant purple color. And then they change to more of a blue. And I've read that's because of changes in pH in the flower, kind of like hydrangeas, if you know that garden plant. Another plant that you'll notice fairly quickly in my garden is bloodroot. And as you can see from the right-hand picture, there's a good reason to call it bloodroot. It has these little tubers, and the roots have this reddish sap in them. And if you break off a root, it actually looks like it's bleeding. I've heard different things about the substances in this plant. I've read that it's all poisonous. I've also read that it's been used medicinally in a variety of ways in the past. Probably both are true, and you just need to know what you're doing with it. And it's been used as a dye as well. I'm rather proud of my stand of bloodroot. I have more bloodroot on the property than I've ever seen in the wild. And that's partly because I encourage it, and it's easy to encourage. It's because it's a more robust plant. It's easier to dig up and transplant, move around, and I can easily do that. And it's also showier, but I'm not sure why in the wild it mostly occurs here and there in smaller clumps when it grows so easily for me everywhere. This is what bloodroot looks like when it's blooming. It blooms really early, sometimes as early as the middle of March. It doesn't last long. Sometimes, like if it gets warm quickly, only maybe 3 days. Other times it'll last as much as 2 weeks if it stays cool. And I always look forward to this explosion in my backyard every spring. In some ways, ephemerals are more precious because they're like friends you only see once a year. Now, I mentioned that I like to transplant bloodroot and encourage its spread, but I'm not the only one. Now, here's a clump of bloodroot that's growing like right by my brush pile. I didn't put it there. And what about that little bloodroot there where you see it out in the middle of the lawn? I certainly didn't plant it there, so who did? Well, that would be ants. Ants like the seeds of bloodroot, and bloodroot makes sure that that's the case because it provides something called an elaeosome. On the outside of the seed, there's this like layer of fats and proteins and lipids that is attractive to ants. And so they carry the seeds of bloodroot off to their dens, and they eat this outside elaeosome coating, and the seed remains intact, it's unharmed, and then the seeds sprout in this rich sort of ant garbage dump environment. Now, I knew that already, but one thing I learned preparing this slideshow is that, this isn't just a bloodroot thing. It's very common among spring ephemerals. And in fact, Myrmica cori, as it's called, seed spreading by ants, is common all around the world. It's one of the ecological functions that ants have. So I think that's kind of neat to look out over my yard at bloodroot coming up in these unusual places and knowing that I've got all these ants at work. Here are some more of the more notable spring flowers. Here are two kinds of trillium. The one on the right, the great white trillium, is a popular one among wildflower people. This photograph was taken at Mary Lee, not at my house. We have a nice big patch of them near the Learning Center that you can see sometime if you get back to Mary Lee. The one on the left is called Toadshade, and it's a little less showy, but the foliage is really pretty. And again, you can see trillium, 3 leaves, lily family, monocot, doing what monocots do. You may wonder, where does she get all these native plants? And I bring that up on this slide because I feel slightly guilty about the one great white trillium that I do have. I almost always get my plants in one of two ways. The one is to buy them from a reputable wildflower nursery. You don't want to just dig them up or buy them from people who are trying to make a buck off of the land, who dug them up themselves, because wildflowers take a long time to mature, to be able to flower. Trillium, I've read, takes 7 years from the time they get started from seed till they will flower. So that's really robbing. You want to look for nursery propagated wildflowers, and that's what I have almost always done. Another way I have gotten them is to trade with friends who also encourage them on their property and know what they're doing. There's a woman named Lucy Miner near Mary Lee who has been working at wildflower gardening with wildflowers for many years, and she and I have traded sometimes. However, this one white trillium at my house, one time at the farmer's market, I found someone was selling plants off the land, and I didn't like the way she was doing it, but there they were sitting there wilting, and I thought, well, at least I know how to take care of them and where they belong. So that's where the one white trillium on my place came from. There originally were 3, but I don't know what happened to the other 2. a lot about why it's a lot about why it's so important to cultivate native species. So I just wanted to throw in this little story that I learned while I was getting ready for this lab, which I found interesting. You probably have heard of or possibly even recognize the garlic mustard plant on the right. That's a common invasive species that's caused a lot of problems in the last 10, 15 years. Well, I learned that it is a close relative to cutleaf toothwort. And one thing that happens when they're in the same area is that this one butterfly that has caterpillars that can only eat cutleaf toothwort, that's its host plant. The butterfly will get confused by this garlic mustard because it's closely related species and puts out some of the same chemicals. But if the butterfly lays its eggs on garlic mustard, its caterpillars can't eat that plant and they die. And in the case of this species that's endangered, I think, that can be a problem. One of my friends in the Mennonite Creation Care Network sent me these two photos. For Earth Day, she sponsored a garlic mustard pull, and there are two of the little girls that were part of it. And they also made garlic mustard pesto. So when in doubt, eat invasive species. This is false rue anemone. It's a very small, delicate woodland flower. I don't have a lot to say about it, so just enjoy. I mentioned earlier that I am not a total purist about only planting native plants. It's hard to be consistent, especially if you're like me and you love all plants. It's easy to go to a garden center and be seduced by some non-native species, or simply, like in my case, I hate to kill things, so sometimes I have a non-native species and it's spreading and it's tempting to move it somewhere else instead of just killing it. So I also want to show you a couple non-native plants and say a little bit about the hows and whys of them. This plant is called lungwort or pulmonaria. It also goes by its genus name. And this plant is kind of aggressive too, but it's a cousin. It's a European cousin to Virginia bluebells. And one of the reasons that I'm happy to have it around is that the bumblebees just go gaga over this plant. It can be, late in the evening and raining, and they're out there doing their thing. Like you can see this one going at it. And again, this genus of plants, as well as Virginia bluebells, has sort of a long base to the flower, so not just anything can get to that nectar and pollinate it. Bumblebees have long tongues, and so it works for them. This is a plant that I wish I didn't have. You see all that green area on the other side of the bridge? That is vinca, which is an invasive ground cover. There was some of it on the property before we got here, and for reasons I have no idea why I did this. I knew better, but for some reason I thought that it would do no harm if I just put little dab of it back behind this bridge. I was offended by this bare spot or something, I don't know. That was maybe 15, 16 years ago. And that 2 square feet is now over 200 square feet. So let that be a lesson to you that it's really important to understand how plants behave before you plant them. And to know, is this an invasive species? Is this one that needs to be watched and maintained in a certain ways? How does it spread? Does it spread by roots, or does it spread by seed? And depending what the answer is, you would treat it in different ways. So let's look at a better way to deal with vinca. You can see why people like to plant vinca. It has a pretty purple flower. Those glossy green leaves stay green all winter, and it forms a thick mat that'll choke out just about anything. So if you want a ground cover, it makes a great ground cover. So if, against all of my advice, you think you have to have vinca someday, here's how to treat it. See how these wise neighbors of ours have put their vinca on a kind of little island here where it's penned in by the house and the driveway? That is a better strategy for a plant like vinca that spreads by rhizomes underground. It doesn't spread by seed particularly, so it should be okay there. That said, you should never underestimate how wily a plant can be, especially one that maybe you don't want all over the place. If you look at the right-hand picture, you'll see a little sprig of vinca that I pulled up. And you'll notice that there's a horizontal line going off to the right without any roots in the middle, but putting roots down again at the other end. That's called a rhizome. Anatomically, it's not a root, even though it's underground. It's a stem. And putting out those kinds of stems are one way that plants reproduce themselves in different places. Vinca produces all kinds of rhizomes. And I think if I'm ever going to address that vinca problem I have in the backyard, I'm going to have to spray it because I just don't see myself digging out 200 square yards of that kind of underground tangle. Mint is another plant that spreads by rhizomes. This is spearmint, and it's a plant I'm happy to grow. I like to make mint tea, and I like to have mint available for a number of recipes, but it is hard to control. And here's an example of a time I tried to outsmart mint. I thought, well, here's this edging that we have sitting in a corner of the garage. What if I made it a little playpen and I planted it in the middle of this circle? Maybe that would contain it. Well, this edging was about 4 inches deep, but obviously that was not nearly deep enough. I think you have to put it in a whole pot to contain it. So you can see this mint was no respecter of my boundaries. It went right up to the edges and formed a wreath, and then it jumped over it. This is what you can expect from a plant that has rhizomes. We're going to leave my backyard now, but I thank you for visiting, and I'd also like to invite you to come back again if you would like to. If you happen to be in the Goshen area right now and you need a particular kind of space for a botany project or something like that, you're very welcome to use our yard. You could contact me through this address. It's the Mennonite Creation Care Network address, if you'd like to do that. And you're also very welcome to join Mennonite Creation Care Network. You don't need to be Mennonite. This is an organization that helps people, mostly people of faith, who are working at caring for the earth, to do that together and to share ideas. So if you'd like to be part of something like that, you can go to the website and look around and fill out the join form, or you can send me an email. Thanks. I'll see you back at Spurgeon Woods.